They called him the Turtle. It wasn't clever, but it was cruel, and for the staff of St. Jude's Metropolitan ER, that was enough. For 2 years, Elias Vance had been the slow, quiet shuffle in the corner of their frantic world. He was the nurse with the pronounced limp, a dragging of the left foot that seemed to echo the weary sigh of the hospital's own ventilation system. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp, the words emerging as if scraped over broken glass, forcing listeners to lean in, an intimacy they resented. He cleaned bedpans with a meticulousness that bordered on obsessive. He stocked supply carts with a deliberate, unhurried pace that drove the charge nurses to sputtering rage. He endured the daily cascade of insults from the ER's reigning monarch, Dr. Alistair Finch, with a placid stillness that they mistook for stupidity. They didn't know about the fine, ochre dust of Kandahar that still seemed to cling to the inside of his lungs. They had no concept of a call sign, whispered with desperate reverence over encrypted channels in the dead of a moonless Afghan night. They certainly didn't expect the sky above their gleaming city hospital to one day fill with a sound like the world tearing in half, a thunder that had nothing to do with the weather. Elias Vance wasn't just a nurse, he was a ghost, and ghosts have a way of waiting. Today, the mockery was particularly sharp. Dr. Finch, a man sculpted by a plastic surgeon and tailored by an artist, stood with his arms crossed over a pristine white coat. His Rolex, a monument to his own self-importance, caught the harsh, fluorescent light. "Vance!" he boomed, his voice echoing in the sudden lull between ambulance sirens. "Did you fall asleep while polishing that IV stand? I could time your movements with a sundial. We're running an emergency room here, not a retirement home." A few of the younger nurses, the ones who orbited Finch like nervous satellites, tittered into their hands. Elias didn't look up. His large, scarred hands continued their methodical wipe-down of the stainless steel pole. He moved with an economy of motion that looked slow to the untrained eye, but was in fact ruthlessly efficient. Every swipe had a purpose. There was no wasted energy. He was conserving something, though no one knew what for. "I asked you a question, Turtle," Finch snapped, stepping closer, invading Elias's space. The smell of his expensive cologne, sharp and synthetic, was an assault. "Are you deaf as well as slow?" Elias finished his task. He placed the disinfectant wipe precisely in the biohazard bin, his movements still unhurried. He finally raised his head, and his eyes, a pale, washed-out blue that seemed to hold ancient shadows, met Finch's. "No, sir," he rasped, the words barely audible. "I heard you." The quiet defiance, the simple statement of fact, was more infuriating to Finch than any argument. It was like punching water. There was no purchase, no satisfying reaction, just that unnerving calm. Finch's handsome face tightened, a mask of contempt slipping into place. "Good. Then maybe you'll hear this. A gurney just came back from radiology covered in contrast dye. I wanted gleaming, and I want it done before the next ice age." He turned on his heel, his entourage of sycophants trailing in his wake, their laughter echoing down the hallway. Elias watched them go. He felt the familiar dull ache in his hip, a souvenir from a fall that hadn't involved a wet hospital floor. He flexed his left hand, tracing a thin, silvery scar that snaked from his knuckle to his wrist in an intricate, almost floral pattern. A shrapnel tattoo. He wasn't slow. He was deliberate. In his former life, deliberation was the difference between a saved life and a neatly folded flag. Here, it was a punchline. He turned his attention to the soiled gurney. The work was honest. It was quiet. And for a ghost, quiet was a mercy. He began to clean, his movements patient and sure, while the ambient chaos of the ER swirled around him, a storm he had learned to stand in the center of, perfectly still. He did not know that a far greater storm was gathering just beyond the city's horizon, a maelstrom that would finally force the ghost to give up his dead. The day wore on, a typical tapestry of controlled chaos and human misery. Finch preened and postured, his voice a constant, grating presence over the intercom and in the halls. He performed a flawless takedown of a junior resident for ordering the wrong imaging study, a public vivisection that left the young doctor pale and trembling. He then spent 20 minutes on the phone, loudly discussing his golf handicap with someone he identified as a major donor to this fine institution. Competence, for Dr. Finch, was secondary to performance, and he was a master performer. Elias continued his silent, circular duties. Stocking the trauma bays was a ritual. He checked every chest tube, every suture kit, every laryngoscope. His large hands, which Finch had once mocked as club-like, moved with surprising delicacy, ensuring every piece of equipment was not just present, but perfectly placed for immediate access. A nurse, Brenda, a woman whose seniority was matched only by her sour disposition, watched him. "You trying to organize them to death, Vance? Just shove him in the drawer. A patient's bleeding out. Nobody's going to care if the 4-0 Vicryl is facing north-northwest." Elias paused, holding a sterile packet of sutures. He looked at the drawer, then back at his own arrangement. He remembered a different kind of drawer, the inside of a medic's pack, slick with mud and someone else's blood. He remembered fumbling for a tourniquet in the pitch black, the frantic search costing precious seconds as a boy's life pumped out into the thirsty Afghan dirt. Seconds matter. Organization is life. "It is faster this way," he rasped, his voice soft but firm. "If you know where it is, you don't have to look." Brenda rolled her eyes and stomped away, muttering about the freaks they hired these days. Elias didn't watch her go. His focus was already back on the task. He was in the middle of restocking Trauma Bay 3 when a code blue was called overhead. A middle-aged man, brought in with chest pain, had gone into cardiac arrest. Finch, ever the hero, rushed to the scene, shoving a first-year resident out of the way to take control of the code. Elias remained where he was, just outside the room, his eyes scanning the scene. He wasn't supposed to be involved in codes. Finch had made that clear on his first day. "You stick to logistics, Vance. Leave the medicine to the professionals." But he watched, and he saw. "Push one of Epi," Finch commanded. A nurse complied. "Starting compressions." A resident, sweating, began the rhythmic pumping on the man's chest. Finch grabbed the defibrillator paddles. "Charging to 200. Clear." The man's body jumped on the gurney. The monitor blipped, still V-fib. "Again. 300. Clear." Another jump. Another failure. Elias saw the problem. It was subtle. Something only 1,000 repetitions under the worst conditions imaginable would teach you. The resident performing CPR was tiring, his compressions becoming shallower, less effective. The heart wasn't being properly primed for the shock. Furthermore, Finch was taking too long between compressions and delivering the shock, letting any built-up pressure dissipate. "Sir?" Elias's voice was a low rumble, barely cutting through the noise. Finch ignored him. "Push another epi. Charging to 360. This is it, people. Clear." "Sir, the compressions." Elias tried again, taking a half step into the room. Finch whirled on him, his face a mask of fury. "Get out! I will not have my code contaminated by the janitorial staff. Go mop something, Vance." The insult hung in the air, thick and ugly. Elias stopped. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He backed out of the room, his limp more pronounced than ever.
He turned his back
as he heard the whine of the defibrillator charging one last time. He didn't need to see the flat line on the monitor a few moments later, or hear Finch call the time of death with a theatrical sigh of feigned regret. He already knew. He walked back to his supply cart, the rhythmic squeak of the wheels a mournful counterpoint to the weeping of the man's wife, which had just begun in the family waiting room. He picked up a pack of gauze, his knuckles white. The waste. The unforgivable waste. There was a new face in the ER that week, a young nurse fresh out of school named Sarah Jenkins. She had wide, earnest eyes and a perpetual look of being overwhelmed, which, in St. Jude's ER, was an accurate assessment of reality. Unlike the others, she hadn't yet learned the cynical shorthand of the veteran staff. She hadn't learned to sneer at Elias. She saw a quiet, diligent man who did his job without complaint. One afternoon, during a rare moment of calm, Sarah was struggling to get a heavy oxygen tank onto a trolley. It slipped, and she let out a small cry as the green cylinder threatened to topple. Before it could hit the floor, a large, scarred hand shot out and steadied it. It was Elias. He had moved with a swiftness that seemed impossible for a man with such a pronounced limp. "Let me," he rasped, his voice gentle. With a single, fluid motion that spoke of immense, controlled strength, he lifted the heavy tank and settled it perfectly into its cradle on the trolley. He secured the straps with practiced ease. "Oh, thank you," Sarah said, flustered. I didn't see you there. You were so quiet." "It is better to be quiet," Elias said, his pale eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. There was a depth in them she couldn't fathom, a weariness that had nothing to do with a long shift. "They call you the Turtle," she blurted out, then immediately clapped a hand over her mouth. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to." Elias gave the faintest hint of a smile. It didn't quite reach his lips, but it flickered in his eyes. "A turtle is slow," he said, his voice a low burr. "But it has a strong shell. It carries its home on its back. It survives." He gave a small nod and turned to leave, his shuffle returning as if he'd consciously put it back on, like a coat. Sarah watched him go, a strange feeling settling in her gut. She had the distinct impression that she had just been speaking to someone far more significant than a slow, quiet, janitorial nurse. Later that day, Dr. Finch was holding court at the Central Nurses' Station. He was regaling his usual audience with a story about his weekend yachting trip. And of course, the idiot deckhand nearly ran us aground near the Cape. Cost me a fortune to hire people who actually know what they're doing. Competence is so rare these days. His eyes swept the ER and landed, as they so often did, on Elias, who was meticulously wiping down a countertop. "Case in point." The sycophants chuckled on cue. Sarah, standing nearby, felt a hot flush of anger. It was pointlessly cruel. The first sign that the day was about to unravel was a subtle change in the soundscape. The usual city symphony of distant sirens began to coalesce into a single, rising, multi-toned shriek. It wasn't one ambulance or two. It was a chorus of them, all screaming towards St. Jude's. A charge nurse looked up from her computer, her head cocked. "What in God's name is that?" A red light began to flash on the main dispatch board. "MCI," someone whispered. Mass casualty incident. The words dropped into the ER like a stone, sending ripples of adrenaline through the staff. Finch's face lit up with a predatory gleam. This was his stage. This was his chance to perform. "All right, people, listen up," he barked, clapping his hands together. "This is what we trained for. I want trauma bays 1 through 5 cleared and prepped, now. I want surgery on standby. I want—" The radio crackled to life, the dispatcher's voice tight with panic. "St. Jude's, this is Central Dispatch. Do you copy? We have a multi-vehicle pileup on the I-5 Express. Catastrophic structural failure of the overpass. I repeat, the overpass has collapsed. We are estimating 50-plus victims, multiple criticals. Oh God. We have a compromised motorcade involved. State Department vehicle. ETA with the first wave is 4 minutes." The air in the ER seemed to solidify. 50-plus. Overpass collapse. State Department. This wasn't just an MCI. This was a nightmare. Finch's bravado faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of panic in his eyes before the mask of command slammed back down. But Elias saw it. He always saw things like that. He was standing by the supply closet, his head tilted, listening not to Finch, but to the approaching sirens. He was calculating. He was preparing. The calm before the storm was over. The first wave hit like a physical blow. Paramedics burst through the automatic doors, their faces grim, shouting reports over the rising din. GCS of 5, massive head trauma. Bilateral femur fractures, hypotensive. Penetrating chest wound, sucking. The carefully orchestrated calm of the ER shattered into a million pieces of raw, screaming chaos. The air grew thick with the metallic tang of blood and the sharp scent of antiseptic. Dr. Finch stood in the center of the storm, a conductor losing control of his orchestra. He pointed and shouted, his voice shrill. "Bay 2! Get him to Bay 2! Where's ortho? Somebody page ortho. I need a CBC and a trauma panel on everyone." His orders were a shotgun blast of activity, lacking focus, lacking prioritization. He was treating the noise, not the patients. Elias moved through the chaos like a ghost. He wasn't rushing. He was flowing, his limp a steady, rhythmic beat in the cacophony. He grabbed a fresh cart, his hands a blur as he loaded it with exactly what would be needed. Chest tubes of varying sizes, central line kits, emergency cricothyrotomy trays, tourniquets. He anticipated needs before the doctors even knew they had them. A young man, barely 20, was wheeled in, his leg mangled and bleeding profusely from a severed femoral artery. A paramedic was desperately trying to apply pressure, but the blood was everywhere, pooling on the floor in a viscous, rapidly expanding lake. Finch glanced at him. "Get him to Bay 4. Put pressure on it," he yelled, before turning his attention to a woman with a less critical, but much louder, head laceration. The paramedic looked at Elias, his eyes wide with panic. "He's going to bleed out! The pressure isn't holding!" Elias didn't hesitate. He reached onto his cart, and his hand came back with a cat tourniquet. He knelt by the gurney, his bad leg protesting. "High and tight," he rasped, his voice a low anchor in the storm. He expertly slid the band high up on the young man's thigh, threaded the strap, and began to twist the windlass. He ignored the patient's agonized scream, his focus absolute. He twisted until the bleeding slowed, then stopped. He secured the windlass and with a marker wrote the time on the patient's forehead. 14:32. Finch, having finished with the screaming woman, turned and saw what Elias had done, his face contorted with rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Vance?" he shrieked, striding over. I am the doctor here. I give the orders. You don't touch my patients. He was exsanguinating, sir, Elias stated simply, his voice flat. The artery was severed. Direct pressure was insufficient. You could cost him his leg, you incompetent fool, Finch screamed, his spittle flying. He reached down as if to loosen the tourniquet. Elias's hand shot out and clamped onto Finch's wrist. It wasn't a violent move, but the strength behind it was shocking. It was like being gripped by a hydraulic press. Finch froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. Elias's pale blue eyes were like chips of ice. He can live without a leg, doctor. He cannot live without blood. Now, you have other patients. He released Finch's wrist. The command was absolute. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow to the space between the two men. Then, the spell broke. Finch, red-faced and sputtering, snatched his hand back. He was about to scream again, but a nurse called his name from another bay. Humiliated and furious, he spun around and stormed off. "Get him to Bay 4, Elias said quietly to the paramedic, who was staring, dumbfounded. "He needs fluids and blood, now." The paramedic nodded, his awe palpable, and pushed the gurney away. Elias rose to his feet. The moment of stillness was over. More victims were pouring in. One gurney was being rushed towards the main trauma bay, surrounded by grim-faced men in dark suits. State Department. This was the centerpiece of the disaster, and he could see from 20 feet away that the man on that gurney was dying. The man on the gurney was drowning in his own blood. A piece of shrapnel from the explosion had torn through his chest, and with every ragged, desperate breath, a frothy pink foam bubbled at his lips. His skin was a ghastly shade of grey, his eyes rolling back in his head. The monitor beside him shrieked a frantic, failing rhythm. "He's in tension pneumothorax," a resident yelled. "His trachea is deviating. We need to decompress." Dr. Finch shoved his way to the head of the bed, grabbing a 14-gauge catheter from a nearby tray. This was his moment. The VIP patient. The one that would get his name in the papers. "I've got it," he announced, his voice tight with a mixture of panic and ego. He positioned the long needle over the man's chest, aiming for the second intercostal space in the mid-clavicular line. He pushed. The needle skidded off a rib. The patient groaned, a horrible, wet sound. Finch swore, his hand shaking slightly. He pulled back and tried again. This time he was too low. He missed the pleural space entirely. The monitor's alarm pitched higher, the oxygen saturation numbers plummeting into the 60s. The man was seconds from cardiac arrest. "Damn it!" Finch snarled, sweat beading on his perfect brow. "His anatomy it's shifted from the trauma." It was a weak excuse, and everyone knew it. He was fumbling. He was failing. The room held its breath. The men in suits pressed closer, their faces masks of controlled fury. Sarah, the young nurse, stood frozen, a tray of useless supplies in her hands, her eyes wide with horror. Then there was movement. Elias didn't ask for permission. He didn't say a word. He simply moved. His limp was gone. He crossed the 10 feet to the gurney in 2 powerful strides. He didn't shove Finch. He simply placed a hand on the doctor's shoulder and applied a gentle, irresistible pressure that moved the man aside as if he were a child's toy. "What the?" Finch began, but the words died in his throat. Elias's eyes were not the placid, weary eyes of the janitorial nurse. They were the eyes of something else entirely. They were ancient, focused, and utterly devoid of fear. He snatched a fresh 14 gauge from the tray Sarah was holding. His left hand palpated the man's chest, not where Finch had been fumbling, but 2 inches over, in the anterior axillary line. His fingers moved with the confident touch of a master craftsman, mapping the landscape of bone and muscle beneath the skin. He found the spot. "Hold him," he commanded. The voice was not the rasping whisper they were used to. It was a low, resonant baritone, a voice forged in the crucible of command. It vibrated with an authority that was absolute. The resident and one of the suits complied instantly, their hands going to the patient's shoulders. Elias didn't hesitate. There was no tremor in his hand. With a single, precise, and brutally efficient motion, he plunged the needle into the man's chest. Puncture. There was a sickening pop as the needle breached the pleural cavity, followed immediately by a loud, sustained hiss. It was the sound of trapped air and life escaping its prison. The effect was instantaneous. The man's body relaxed. The frantic pressure in his chest vanished. He took a gasping, shuddering breath, a real breath. The monitor, which had been screaming a death sentence, began to chirp a steadier, saner rhythm. The oxygen saturation numbers began a steady climb. 70, 80, 92. The room went dead silent. The only sounds were the beeping of the monitor and the quiet, steady hiss of air from the catheter still embedded in the patient's chest. Elias held the catheter in place, his gaze fixed on the monitor, his expression unreadable. He had just performed a life-saving, high-risk procedure with a level of skill and speed that bordered on supernatural. He had done it after being relegated to cleaning floors for 2 years. Dr. Finch stared, his mouth agape, his face a mottled canvas of shock, fury, and humiliation. He looked from the stabilized patient to the quiet nurse, who was still holding his wrist in a grip of iron. No, not a nurse, not the turtle. He was staring at a stranger. "Get me a chest tube tray," Elias said, his new voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. He looked at Sarah. "Now!" Sarah, jolted from her stupor, practically flew to the supply cart. The spell was broken. The ER staff began to move again, but the entire dynamic of the room had shifted on its axis. The center of gravity was no longer the handsome, credentialed chief of the ER. It was the quiet man with the limp, who was currently saving the life of one of the most important men in the country. The ghost was out, and he was just getting started. The air in Trauma Bay 1 seemed to change, to crackle with a new kind of energy. Elias Vance was no longer a peripheral figure. He was the calm, unshakable center of the hurricane. With the VIP patient stabilized for the moment, he moved, his actions a symphony of brutal efficiency. "He's got a cardiac tamponade," Elias said, his eyes on a woman who had been wheeled in with a steering wheel imprint on her chest. Her blood pressure was crashing, her heart sounds muffled. Finch, still reeling, was staring blankly at her chart. "We need an ultrasound to confirm," Finch stammered, trying to reclaim some semblance of authority. "There's no time," Elias countered, his voice flat and final. He was already grabbing a long spinal needle and a 60 cubic centimeter syringe. "His pulse is thready, his veins are collapsing. He'll arrest before you even turn the machine on. I need betadine and a sterile drape." A veteran nurse, one who had sneered at Elias just that morning, now looked at him with wide, fearful eyes and scrambled to get the supplies. This wasn't a suggestion. It was an order from an authority she didn't understand, but could not deny. "You can't do a pericardiocentesis blind," Finch shrieked, his voice cracking. "The protocol..." "The protocol is for a hospital, doctor," Elias cut him off, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. Not for a battlefield, and right now, this is a battlefield. He expertly prepped the patient's chest, his movements economical and swift. He found his landmark just below the xiphoid process. I'm going in. He advanced the needle, his eyes locked on the cardiac monitor, his hand impossibly steady. The staff watched, mesmerized. This was a high-risk, Hail Mary procedure, one most ER doctors would only attempt with ultrasound guidance. Elias was doing it by feel, by instinct, by a level of experience that was utterly alien to this sterile environment. He felt the telltale pop as the needle entered the pericardial sac. He began to pull back on the plunger. Dark, non-clotting blood filled the syringe. 10 cubic centimeters, 20 cubic centimeters, 40 cubic centimeters. As the syringe filled, the frantic waveform on the monitor began to widen, to strengthen. The patient's blood pressure, which had been a terrifying 60/30, began to climb. 80/50, 100/60. It was like watching a miracle in real time. Elias withdrew the needle and calmly squirted the blood onto a piece of gauze. It didn't clot. It's pericardial, he confirmed unnecessarily. He had bought her time. He had saved another life. He turned to the stunned resident beside him. Get her to the OR. Tell the cardiothoracic surgeon to expect a ventricular laceration. The resident just nodded, speechless, and ran. Finch watched, his face ashen. He was becoming a spectator in his own emergency room. His authority had evaporated. The staff, who minutes ago had hung on his every word, now looked past him, their eyes fixed on Elias. They were a flock that had found a new shepherd, one who actually knew the way out of the valley of death. "Vance, this is my department," Finch finally managed to roar, his desperation making his voice shrill. "You are a nurse. You are operating so far outside your scope of practice that you will never work again. I will have your license. I will have you arrested." Elias was already at the next gurney, assessing a patient with a severe abdominal injury. He didn't even turn to look at Finch. He simply spoke, his voice carrying over the din. "The man in Bay 1, the one you almost killed, has a sucking chest wound. You put a non-vented dressing on it. In 3 minutes, he'll be in the same tension pneumothorax you failed to diagnose in the first patient. Fix it." It wasn't an insult. It was a calm, cold statement of fact, a diagnosis of Finch's incompetence. And it was delivered with the chilling finality of a judge's sentence. Every nurse, every resident in earshot heard it. They saw Finch's face drain of all color. He knew Elias was right. He had made a rookie mistake, a fatal one. Humiliation, warred with self-preservation. He scurried over to Bay 1, not daring to meet anyone's eyes, and began fumbling with the dressing. The balance of power had not just shifted, it had been utterly and irrevocably shattered. The turtle was gone. In his place stood a warrior, a commander, a man who moved through the carnage with a terrifying and beautiful competence. The staff no longer saw a slow, shuffling janitor. They saw a savior, and they followed him without question, their previous mockery a source of deep, burning shame. The ghost was now in command of the ER, and the battle for lives had just begun. For the next hour, time seemed to dissolve into a series of life-or-death vignettes, each one starring Elias Vance. He moved from patient to patient, a grim specter of efficiency. He diagnosed a ruptured spleen with a single, expert palpation of an abdomen. He set a compound fracture with a sickening crack, fashioning a temporary splint from a discarded IV pole and medical tape. He performed an emergency cricothyrotomy on a man with crushed facial bones, using a scalpel and a section of IV tubing to create an airway where none existed, his hands moving in a blur of controlled violence under the flickering fluorescent lights. His orders were short, precise, and were followed without question. "Get me O-neg blood, 4 units, wide open. I need a neuroconsult for the girl with the blown pupil, now. Tell the lab to stop running panels and start cross-matching. We need blood, not data." He had transformed the chaotic ER into a functioning field hospital. He was triaging not just patients, but resources, his mind a supercomputer processing dozens of variables at once. Sarah Jenkins, the young nurse, became his shadow. She anticipated his needs, handing him instruments before he asked, her initial fear replaced by a profound, all-consuming awe. She watched his hands, the same hands she'd seen meticulously wiping down counters, now suturing a complex facial laceration with the speed and precision of a master weaver. The scars on them were no longer just marks, they were a roadmap of a life she couldn't possibly imagine. Dr. Finch, meanwhile, had been reduced to a ghost in his own kingdom. He tried to reassert himself, walking up to a patient Elias had just stabilized. "All right, let's see what we have here," he said, affecting a professional tone. Elias, without looking up from the patient he was currently working on, simply said, "Don't touch him. You're in shock. You'll make a mistake." The quiet dismissal, the clinical assessment of Finch's own mental state, was the final, crushing blow. Defeated, Finch retreated to a corner of the nurse's station, holding a chart he wasn't reading, a useless king staring at the ruins of his castle. It was in the middle of this controlled storm that the sound began. At first it was a low, distant thrumming, a vibration felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. It grew steadily, a deep, rhythmic beating that seemed to shake the very foundations of the hospital. Whump, 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 whump. It was a sound of immense power, a sound that did not belong in a city's sky. Heads began to turn. Nurses and doctors looked up at the ceiling, their faces confused. The windows of the ER waiting room rattled in their frames. The sound grew louder, deafening, until it was a physical presence, a crushing weight of noise that drowned out the alarms and the screams. Sarah ran to the window. Her jaw dropped. "Oh my God," she whispered. Descending from the grey, overcast sky were not 1 or 2 helicopters, but 6. They were sleek, black, and menacing. UH-60 Black Hawks. They moved with the predatory grace of war machines, their rotors churning the air into a violent vortex. 2 landed with practiced precision on the hospital's main helipad, while the other 4, impossibly, took up hovering positions over the surrounding streets, their downdraft whipping trees and scattering debris. Black-clad figures began rappelling from 2 of the hovering choppers, descending with terrifying speed onto the hospital roof and the ambulance bay. Hospital security guards ran out, their faces a mixture of terror and confusion, their small sidearms looking like toys against the unfolding military operation. The main doors of the ER burst open. They weren't pushed by paramedics this time, they were kicked open. A team of 12 soldiers, clad in full tactical gear, night vision goggles, flipped up on their helmets, rifles held at a low ready, swarmed into the room. They moved with a fluid, lethal grace, securing the entrances, their eyes scanning everything, assessing threats. The ER staff froze. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. At their head was a man who radiated an authority that made Dr. Finch's petty tyranny seem like a child's tantrum. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He wore a crisp, decorated uniform, and on the collar of his jacket were the silver stars of a lieutenant general. He swept his gaze over the controlled chaos, his eyes missing nothing. They landed on the cowering form of Dr. Finch. The general's lip curled in a slight sneer. He strode forward, his boots making no sound on the linoleum floor. "Who's in charge here?" the general barked, his voice a gravelly roar that cut through the rotor wash. Dr. Finch, seeing an opportunity to salvage his dignity, puffed out his chest. "I am," he declared, stepping forward. "I am Dr. Alistair Finch, Chief of Emergency Medicine. This is a civilian hospital, General. You have no jurisdiction here." The general didn't even slow down. He walked right up to Finch, his sheer presence forcing the doctor to take a step back. The general looked down at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. "I'm not here for you, Doctor," he growled. His eyes continued their sweep of the room, a predator searching for a very specific target. "I'm looking for one of my men. We received a distress signal, an emergency transponder I haven't heard in 5 years. Tell me." The general's voice dropped, becoming dangerously quiet. "Where is he?" Finch, emboldened by the perceived validation of being addressed, immediately launched into self-aggrandizing mode. He gestured grandly at the trauma bay where the VIP, the Secretary of Defense, lay stabilized. "General, I am Dr. Finch, head of this department. Your man is right here. We've had a difficult situation, a catastrophic event, but I'm proud to say my team and I have it completely under control. The Secretary is stable, thanks to my direct intervention." He practically preened, imagining the commendations, the press conferences. This was the moment he could spin this disaster into a personal triumph. The general gave Finch a long, cold look. A look that could freeze fire. "You," he said, the word dripping with scorn, "did nothing." It wasn't an accusation, it was a statement of fact. The general's gaze swept past Finch, past the stunned faces of the nurses and residents, past the rows of wounded. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, were taking in the details. The expertly applied tourniquet, the perfectly placed chest tube, the blind pericardiocentesis that had saved a life. His gaze followed the invisible lines of order within the chaos, and they all led to one place. His eyes finally landed on the figure bent over a young girl with a severe head injury. Elias. He was covered in blood that wasn't his own, his shabby scrubs stained dark. He was calmly checking the girl's pupillary response with a penlight, his movements gentle and focused, seemingly oblivious to the military invasion behind him. The general's entire demeanor shifted. The hard granite mask softened, replaced by an expression of profound respect and something akin to relief. The soldiers flanking him relaxed almost imperceptibly, their posture shifting from aggressive readiness to watchful waiting. The crushing tension in the room lessened, replaced by a deep, vibrating curiosity. General Marcus Thorne walked past the sputtering Dr. Finch as if he were a piece of furniture. He stopped a respectful distance from where Elias was working. He didn't interrupt. He waited. He, a 3-star general in command of the nation's most elite forces, waited for the quiet, limping nurse to finish his work. Elias finished his assessment, murmured a reassuring word to the terrified girl, and straightened up slowly, his bad leg protesting the long hours. He turned. His pale blue eyes met the general's. There was a flicker of recognition, a silent conversation that passed between them in a heartbeat, a conversation that spanned years and continents, deserts and mountains, fire and blood. "Ghost Actual," the general said, his voice now a low, respectful rumble. "We received your signal. It's good to see you, son." The name echoed in the sudden, tomb-like silence of the ER. Ghost Actual. It wasn't a name, it was a call sign, a legend. The entire ER staff froze. Every eye swiveled from the decorated general to the quiet nurse they had called the Turtle. Dr. Finch's jaw, which had been flapping uselessly, snapped shut. His face, already pale, turned a ghastly, waxy white. The blood seemed to have drained from it entirely, leaving behind a mask of pure, uncomprehending terror. "General Thorne," Elias rasped, his voice returning to its usual gravelly whisper. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Took you long enough?" A slow smile spread across the general's face. "You know how it is? Traffic was a nightmare." The dry, understated humor was so out of place, so surreal, that it only deepened the sense of unreality. Finch finally found his voice, a high-pitched, incredulous squeak. "Ghost? What is this? Vance, who is this man? What is going on?" General Thorne turned his head slowly, pinning Finch with a glare that felt like a physical weight. "Dr. Finch," he began, his voice dropping back into its command register, each word a perfectly polished stone of contempt. "For the last 2 years you've had a hero working in your hospital, a man to whom this nation, and I personally, owe an unpayable debt. And you arrogant, incompetent peacock, have had him cleaning up vomit." He took a step closer to Finch, who involuntarily shrank back. "Let me tell you who Vance is. This is Sergeant First Class Elias Vance, United States Army Special Forces, Senior Medical Sergeant, 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. You might know them as Delta Force." A collective gasp went through the room. Special Forces. Delta. The names were mythical. "But even that doesn't do him justice," Thorne continued, his voice rising, resonating with a cold fury. "To the men he served with, the men whose lives he held in his hands in the worst places on earth, he is known by another name. A name he earned in the shadows of the Hindu Kush, a name whispered by the enemy like a curse. Ghost Actual, the man who could walk through hell and bring his people back." Thorne pointed a finger at the stabilized Secretary of Defense. "The signal we received wasn't a call for help. It was a sentinel beacon. It's a failsafe, activated only when a high-value asset is compromised and in the care of incompetent medical personnel. It transmits vital signs, environmental audio, and a full tactical assessment. I have spent the last 20 minutes in a helicopter listening to a live feed of your catastrophic failure, Doctor. I heard you misdiagnose, I heard you fumble, and I heard you nearly kill one of the most important men in our government. And then..." The general turned his gaze back to Elias, his voice softening again. "I heard a ghost go to work." The public humiliation was absolute. It was a surgical strike, delivered with devastating precision in front of the very people Finch had lauded his authority over. The nurses who had laughed at Elias, the residents who had feared Finch, the entire staff stood as a silent jury, witnessing the complete and utter dismantling of a man. Finch's face crumpled. The arrogance, the pride, the carefully constructed facade of superiority, it all dissolved into a puddle of pathetic, whimpering fear. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was a hollow man, his core scooped out and put on display for all to see. The king was not just naked, he had never been a king at all. The hospital administrator, a portly man named Henderson, who had been alerted to the commotion, arrived breathless and sweating, flanked by two terrified-looking security guards.
He saw the soldiers,
The general, the ashen face of his star doctor, and the blood-soaked nurse at the center of it all. "General, what is the meaning of this? This is highly irregular." General Thorne didn't even look at him. His focus was entirely on Elias. "Son, what's the secretary's status? My medical team is ready to transport." Before Elias could answer, one of the general's own medics, a major with a chest full of ribbons, stepped forward after quickly assessing the patient. He turned to Thorne, his voice filled with professional admiration. "Sir, the interventions are textbook. No, they're better than textbook. The needle decompression was placed perfectly to avoid the lung parenchyma. Chest tube is secure, and he even started a secondary IV line in the external jugular. Whoever did this work is a master." He looked at Elias, his eyes widening in dawning comprehension. You did this?" Elias just nodded. "My God," the medic whispered. "I read about field techniques like this in after-action reports. They were attributed to Ghost Actual." General Thorne finally turned to the sputtering administrator. "Mr. Henderson," he said, his voice dangerously calm, "the meaning of this is that Sergeant Vance just single-handedly saved the life of the Secretary of Defense, along with half a dozen other civilians, after your chief of medicine here proved himself incapable of running a first aid stand." He gestured to Elias's leg. "You see that limp, Mr. Henderson? He got that on his last mission, pulling 3 men out of a burning vehicle after an IED strike. The explosion shredded his vocal cords, which is why he speaks the way he does. He was shielding his men with his own body. For that action, he was awarded the Medal of Honor." Another shockwave rolled through the room. The Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for valor. The quiet, slow man they had mocked was in the same pantheon as Audie Murphy and Desmond Doss. Sarah, the young nurse, brought a hand to her mouth, her eyes shining with tears. Brenda, the sour veteran nurse, looked like she wanted the floor to swallow her whole. "He never wears it," Thorne continued. "He came here to be quiet, to heal. He took a job well below his abilities because he was tired of fighting. And you people, you let this child," he gestured dismissively at Finch, "torment him for 2 years." Thorne's command team began to coordinate the transport of the secretary. They moved with quiet, deadly professionalism, deferring to Elias on every detail. "Should we start a dopamine drip for the transport, Sergeant?" the major asked.
"No,"
Elias rasped. "His pressure is stable. The dopamine will increase myocardial oxygen demand. Keep him on lactated ringers, slow drip. Watch for any changes in his respiratory status." The major nodded, accepting the order without question. A sergeant deferring to a major was unheard of. But this wasn't about rank. It was about competence. It was about acknowledging a master of their craft. As they prepared to move the gurney, Elias paused and walked over to the young girl he had been treating. He knelt down, ignoring the pain in his hip, and spoke to her, his gravelly voice now impossibly gentle. "You're going to be okay," he said. "You're very brave." He then stood and addressed the neurosurgeon who had just arrived. "She has a possible epidural hematoma. Left pupil is sluggish. She needs a CT scan and an OR immediately." The surgeon, one of the hospital's top talents, simply nodded. "On it." The recognition was complete. The validation cascaded from every corner of the room,
from the general,
from his elite medics, from the hospital's own top specialists. The truth of who Elias Vance was had been laid bare, and it was more astonishing than any of them could have imagined. He was not the turtle. He was a titan. Weeks bled into a month. The echoes of that chaotic afternoon still reverberated through the halls of St. Jude's. The story had become the stuff of hospital legend, whispered in break rooms and cafeterias, each telling, adding another layer of myth to the quiet man at its center. Dr. Alastair Finch was gone. Fired the day after the incident, he was now the subject of multiple malpractice investigations and a career-ending inquiry by the medical board. His name, once a symbol of prestige, was now a cautionary tale about the lethal dangers of arrogance. The hospital administration, desperate to mitigate the public relations nightmare, had offered Elias Vance the position of Director of Trauma Medicine. They had also offered him a truly staggering salary and a formal, groveling apology from the entire board. He hadn't given them an answer yet. Elias was standing on the hospital helipad, the same one the Black Hawks had descended upon. The city stretched out before him, a sprawling tapestry of steel and glass. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows. He was not in his shabby scrubs. He wore clean, simple slacks and a button-down shirt. The limp was still there. The raspy voice was still his. But he stood differently. The weight of his hidden identity finally lifted. The door to the helipad opened, and General Thorne walked out. He was in his dress uniform, the chest a solid block of colored ribbons. "They told me I'd find you up here," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Contemplating your new kingdom?" Elias gave a slight smile. "Just getting some air." "The secretary is asking for you," Thorne said, standing beside him. "He's making a full recovery. He wants to thank you in person. The president, too." "I did my job," Elias rasped simply. "You always do," Thorne said. He was quiet for a moment, the two men looking out over the city. "I came to ask you for something, Elias. We're losing too many good medics in the field. They have the skills, but they don't have the instinct, the calm. What you have. We're revamping the training program at Fort Bragg. I want you to run it. Write the book. Teach the next generation how to be ghosts." It was a hell of an offer. A return to the world he knew, the world he had been forged in. A chance to shape the future, to save lives on a scale he never could as a single operator. "This hospital wants me to be their trauma chief," Elias said, his gaze distant. "I know," Thorne nodded. "You could do a lot of good here, too. Fix what's broken in this system. God knows it needs it." He clapped a heavy hand on Elias's shoulder. "The choice is yours, son. Battlefield or ER. Just promise me you won't go back to cleaning floors." Elias looked at the general, his pale eyes clear. "I promise." The final scene took place 2 weeks later. The ER at St. Jude's was different. The frantic, chaotic edge had been replaced by a sense of quiet, focused purpose. At the center of it, directing the flow, was Elias Vance. He had accepted the hospital's offer. He wore a crisp, tailored lab coat, Dr. Elias Vance, Director of Trauma Medicine, embroidered over the pocket. The doctor was an honorary title insisted upon by the board, but the authority was real. He walked through the department, his limp no longer a source of mockery, but a symbol of his journey. The staff parted before him, their greetings of "Sir" and "Dr. Vance," filled with a deep and genuine respect. He saw Sarah, the young nurse, struggling to insert an IV into a patient with difficult veins. She was frustrated, on the verge of giving up. Elias walked over, his presence calm and reassuring. "Let me show you something," he rasped, his voice low. He didn't take the needle from her. Under his guidance, she advanced the needle. It slid in perfectly. A flash of red in the chamber. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with gratitude and admiration. Thank you, sir," she stammered. "You did the work," Elias said. "You just needed to trust yourself." He gave her a small, encouraging nod and continued his rounds. He was no longer a ghost. He was a guardian. He hadn't chosen the battlefield in the desert. He had chosen this one, the one made of linoleum and fluorescent lights, of fear and hope. He was home. The turtle had survived, and he had carried his home on his back the entire time. Now he was ready to teach others how to build a shell of their own.